these informal talks on history and archaeology. My name is Dr. Dan Jones, and in the previous talk we looked at the way in which ancient Egypt was destroyed and even its very memory was lost. Europe did not begin to recover any information about Egypt until the expedition of, surprisingly enough, Napoleon Bonaparte. The plundering and destruction of antiquities which began at that point has continued right up to today, but parallel with this has become a more responsible attitude. There has been a growth in the science of archaeology and the development of the academic study of Egyptology. This really began actually with les savants right at the beginning, but it was from the 1830s onwards the much more professional attitude began to emerge. We began to understand that information could be just as valuable as objects of gold and silver. Starting in the 1830s, there was a series of great archaeologists who came to work in Egypt. The work of each Egyptologist has its own value, but in addition, each was part of a progressive movement towards the development of a scientific discipline. It was in 1843 that the great naturalist Alexander von Humboldt persuaded the King of Prussia to send an expedition to Egypt. This expedition would be led by the brilliant young Karl Richard Lepsius. That was a good choice, Frederick. The influence of Napoleon's savants from a generation earlier can clearly be seen in this expedition. The trip would last 3 years, and there was to be no hurried grab for antiquities, but there would be proper time for detailed investigation and contemplation. Lepsius was one of the first to come to realise how long this civilization had lasted and how very old were its origins, possibly more than 7,000 years before modern times. He also began to understand that the physical relics he could see all around were the product of a complex and mysterious society that was still unknown and even unsuspected at that time. Certainly his drawings emphasised both the bizarre beauty of the remains and the strangeness of the civilization that must have produced them. His long-term, careful planning and recording provided a list of not just 4 or 5 pyramids, but no less than 67. Some were rather battered, and some, like the tomb of Sahuri at Abusir, will prove to be very important. Pyramids were not just architecture. They reflected the development of religion and, to a surprising extent, changes in politics, particularly in the status of the king. He also examined and recorded the so-called mastaba tombs, and he realised that they were even older than the pyramids, and were the resting places of ancient kings and their long-dead nobility. As Lepsius began to suspect, we now know that the mastaba tombs were created about 3100 to 2600 BCE, at the time of the earliest kings for the rulers and for the nobility. Each had a set of rooms at surface level containing statues and offerings. Below this were 1 or more deep shafts. At the bottom of one was placed the body of the king or the noble. We will see that the development of these shafts would create the whole process of mummification. He created and brought back many plans of tombs and other structures, such as these from the Valley of the Kings. Material like this formed the basis of study for the next generation of students. He was one of the first serious visitors to a place called Amarna, which had been the capital of the strange, deformed and heretical pharaoh Akhenaten. He made copies of many inscriptions and took casts of various extraordinary reliefs. This turned out to be very important, as many of the remains from this site have since been destroyed, and his are the only records. A major part of his importance comes from his manifold communication skills, not just in writing, but as here, the ability to bring back to Europe an idea of the grandeur and majesty of Egypt. This is the splendid hall he designed for the Berlin New Museum in 1850. Here are housed some of his finds. But it is his remarkable series of publications that did most to reveal Egypt to Europe, and which makes him such a pivotal figure. The series includes his rather difficult works on ancient linguistics, a subject with perhaps less appeal than giant temples and bizarre gods. During the 19th century, there evolved a great interest in prehistory in France and in Britain, and the need to try to recover as much information as possible from these scanty early remains led to the formalisation both of excavation techniques and of recording. We also became very aware of the importance of what, in other circumstances, might be considered rubbish, just small pieces of broken flint or tiny pot shards. From this grew the academic study of prehistoric Europe and, of course, the academic study of Egyptology. Many consider General Pitt Rivers as the man that, by 1900, had formalised and introduced a modern, methodical and scientific approach to archaeology. Certainly every excavator today obeys the General's rules if he or she wishes to be taken seriously. As a soldier, Pitt Rivers had been interested in the development of the musket into the rifle. He later saw the same idea of development in such things as flint tools and pottery. Knowing where a piece fitted into a sequence gave you an idea of at least its relative dating, early, middle or late. He also developed the technique of identifying layers, as can be seen in the sides of a trench, and this is generally known as stratigraphy. Each layer is removed completely before the next layer is dug. The finds in each layer, perhaps just a few pot shards, give it a date. Each layer is also normally later than the one beneath. This also gives a relative dating to the layers and to the finds. Historians use written records to produce their histories, and we now know that the Egyptians, like many others, could tell lies if they wanted to. Now, early Egyptologists regarded items such as pot shards as worthless, but by using the techniques developed by Pitt Rivers and other archaeologists, we can now sometimes produce a history that was otherwise unknowable from written records. And it is a history that may be confusing, but it does not tell lies. French influence in Egypt continued to grow even after Napoleon's invasion. And later on, despite the large number of British, German and American archaeologists who came to Egypt, France has always had a special place in Egypt and its antiquities. An important figure for both Egyptology and French influence was Auguste Mariette. He worked tirelessly in Egypt between 1850 and 1881, and he became conservator of Egyptian monuments. At this stage, however, there was still a strong expectation that he would forward his best finds to the Louvre, where he had a junior position. His role, however, was not just to enhance Egyptology, but to ensure that French influence remained paramount. He was responsible for a number of major excavations and finds. In 1851 he discovered the extraordinary Serapeum at Saqqara, huge underground chambers with the giant tombs of the sacred bulls of Apis. In 1857 he cleared the sand completely from the Sphinx, and in doing so discovered the so-called Sphinx Temple with its unbelievably huge granite blocks. Of course, the craze for Egyptian art has continued long after Les Savants. In 1869, Mariette wrote a dramatic piece which is used by Verdi as the basis for his Egyptian opera, Aida. The first stage sets were also partly the work of Mariette. Mariette died in 1881, and he was buried, appropriately enough, in a sarcophagus in the grounds of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. In order to continue the French influence, he appointed another Frenchman, Gaston Maspero, to be his successor shortly before his death. Gaston Maspero worked in Egypt from 1880 to 1914. He became head of the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale and Director General of Excavations and Antiquities in Egypt. He was a very clever man, but I don't think he'll get a signal down there, do you? Maspero dug many sites, including at Saqqara and near the Sphinx. He also worked at the amazing temples of Karnak. Perhaps his greatest claim to fame in Egyptian eyes was that he was the first man to introduce charges for tourists at the most famous sites. Maspero was, perhaps, primarily a linguist, and he certainly made a great point of photographing and drawing hundreds of inscriptions. Some of these have since become damaged, so his records are of very great value. Maspero produced many publications which are authoritative but are also at the same time very easy to read. Here are some illustrations from one of his best known works, The Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt. And here is a picture of the front cover of one of my own books by him. The practice of looting was still in full swing, and Maspero was so incensed by the constant plundering and damage that he had the police arrest two brothers well known for looting. They confessed under torture to robbing the royal site at Deir el-Bahari. Maspero was able to locate this site, and from it he was able to recover the mummies of no less than 4 pharaohs: Seti I, Amenhotep I, Thutmose III, and most famous of all, the remains of one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, or so he said, Ramses II, Ramses the Great. Many years later, the body of Ramses II was flown to Paris for further investigation. To assist the journey, the Egyptian authorities issued Ramses with a passport declaring that his occupation was king (deceased). Photography was one of the scientific advances that helped to record the progress of excavations, but it was also a great medium for publicising the exotic past. In 1849, just 10 or 20 years after the development of mobile photography, 2 French travellers, Maxime Duchamp and the writer Gustave Flambert, journeyed up and down the Nile, an early tourist trip. Here is one of Duchamp's photographs. It is of the beautiful little temple of Isis, which stood at Philae. In modern times, it has been moved to make way for the Aswan Dam. As well as recording the site, it records the state into which these monuments had fallen. And here is an ancestor of the thousands of photographs which have now been taken of the pyramids. I have to confess that I am so overwhelmed by the scene that I take the same shots every time I visit. It's also clear that locals giving camel and donkey rides have been doing this for a long while. I just wonder how far back this goes. James Henry Breasted was the first American to receive a PhD in Egyptology. It came from the University of Berlin in 1894. He went on to join the faculty of the University of Chicago and then became the first American professor of Egyptology and Oriental history. Each Egyptologist added his own special piece to the jigsaw that was not just the science of Egyptology, but the public awareness of a great civilization. Breasted was a great linguist, and perhaps the greatest part of his legacy is the large number of publications rescuing and publicizing ancient texts for the benefit of the American public. He was a great publicist, and his absorbed interest in Egypt helped to create the increasingly important American involvement in Egyptology. For political and academic reasons, the British were always hard on the heels of the French. And the British archaeologists actually formed quite a fascinating bunch of people. That they had a flair, and they had a flair for conflict and excitement. But this was all part of quite a heady mix of French, Germans, Americans and British. Altogether, they helped to make archaeology in Egypt as interesting as ancient Egypt itself. In 1892, William Flinders Petrie became the first professor of archaeology in Britain at University College London. He went on to spend more than 50 years working in Egypt. He worked on a number of important sites, but for many people his greatest discovery was that of an inscribed stone known as the Victory Stele of Merneptah. This was found in Thebes in 1896. It is dated to about 1200 BCE, and the interest lies in the fact that it contains the earliest textual reference to the people of Israel. Unfortunately, it records their defeat by the Pharaoh. Despite many biblical references to Egypt, this is, in fact, the only Egyptian textual reference to the Israelites yet found. Perhaps there is more, hidden somewhere in the sands. He was a very careful surveyor, and he developed an advanced system of triangulation before he ever went to Egypt. Indeed, he started with a plan of Stonehenge. His system of triangulation was developed in order to increase the accuracy of recording sites, and his plan of the pyramids at Giza is still used today. Flinders Petrie carried out a meticulous observation of pottery styles, and his careful recording allowed him to create a relative dating system very much in the style of General Pitt Rivers. Not only was this dating independent of the written records, but it also covered aspects of life not considered worth mentioning at the time. His sequence goes back even to pre-dynastic remains. He created a powerful tool for understanding everyday life as well as the great events of the past. Howard Carter was just 17 when he first came to Egypt in 1891, and he worked for a season with Flinders Petrie. In 1899, aged 25, he became the Chief Inspector of Egyptian Antiquities. He finally left Egypt in 1924 after a certain spectacular success. He went for a career in lecturing and working as an agent for various museums. Once in Egypt, he worked first on the tombs at Beni Hassan, developing improved techniques for recording wall decorations and inscriptions. Later, he used these skills while working with Edouard Naville on the frescoes of the famous temple of Hatshepsut at Dia el-Bahari near Thebes. In 1922, after years of careful planning and endless hard work, just as time and money were running out, Carter found the only untouched royal tomb yet found. Actually, it had been opened by robbers almost as soon as it had been closed, but they were caught before doing too much damage. The tomb was of a young lad called Tutankhamun, one of the least known and least important of the pharaohs. Yet, because of this find, he is the most famous of pharaohs, and for many people, the only one they have ever heard of. As King Tut, he is the only pharaoh to have had a modern nickname, King Tut. Of course, Carter was struck down by the mummy's curse. Only it did not happen until 17 years later and looked very much like a heart attack. Egyptology can, believe it or not, sometimes be quite dull and complicated. So it might be easier to read a novel or a good story based on ancient Egypt. As long as the book is well written and it is authoritative, this is a jolly good idea. It's a good way to learn something about ancient Egypt. And it's very suitable for people who would not be seen dead with a history book. Some stories seek to recreate more or less modern Egypt and the excitements of classical Egyptology. The amazing adventures of Amelia Peabody in Egypt have already been mentioned. There is also Agatha Christie, who was married to an archaeologist, and she wrote several fascinating archaeological mystery stories set both in modern and ancient times. Several writers have tried to reconstruct life in ancient Egypt itself. As a result of intensive research, my wife tells me that the novels of Christian Jacques and Paul Doherty are worth a read, but she adds that there are many more. It is a matter of taste, but the novels should be accurate as well as spellbinding. The damage and loss to Egyptian antiquities continues to this very day. In fact, the recent political unrest has made the situation even worse. There has been some attempt made to record just how much damage is being caused, but very little attempt has been made, it seems, to stop the losses. On the other hand, we now have new science and new technologies which are helping us to get even more information from the material we are able to examine. The fascination with ancient Egypt continues as strongly as ever it did before, and we are lucky to have a generation of Egyptologists who are worthy successors to the great classical archaeologists of the 19th century. Sadly, this sort of thing is a very common sight. It is a whole series of pits dug by looters. Any valuable finds are dragged from the historical context to go off to secret buyers, and much valuable archaeological material is completely destroyed in the process. This lady is Dr. Sarah Parkak, and she has been working on using high-quality satellite images to search for archaeological sites. Now she is using this material to identify and record modern looting. You can see here the archaeological excavation, and below the machine gun-like scatter of pits dug by thieves. But new techniques are beginning to add more to our store of knowledge. For example, divers have brought to light wonderful finds from the flooded areas north of the delta, that is, in the Mediterranean. There's a great deal of material which has come from the famous city of Alexandria waiting for us under the water. Another important sign for the future is that the modern Egyptians are concerning themselves with the excavation and protection of their past. The archaeologist Mostafa Waziri has recently excavated this tomb in Dra el Naga near the Valley of the Kings. It contains the burial of an important goldsmith called Amenhotep and his family. It dates to the 18th dynasty, something like 1550 to 1292 BCE, and this in fact is the time of the famous Tutankhamun. There are advances too in modern communication. This is important. We have a saying in archaeology that nothing is found until it is published. That is, until everyone knows about it. One leading man in this field is archaeologist John Romer. His DVDs and television programs have become very popular. The important thing is that he is both interesting and authoritative. Perhaps, however, some sources are more entertaining than educational. Egypt has shown us some wonderful things. Egypt has told us fantastic stories. Is that it? Do we know everything? Did the great archaeologists of the 19th century find everything? Far from it. Egypt still has so much to show us and so much to teach us. As recently as 2018, at a place called Minya near Cairo, a cache of over 40 sarcophagi was discovered. The chief find was the tomb of the High Priest of Thoth, a tomb which was surrounded by the remains of many members of his family. Egypt still has so much more to astonish us. In this talk we've looked at the loss and recovery of information about ancient Egypt and the growth of archaeology and Egyptology. Now we can turn to look at geology, geography and climate and to see what part they have played in the creation of this ancient civilization.